In the first 3 chapters of our exploration into the Sumerian and Akkadian records, we examined the foundational myths of the ancient Near East. We analyzed the Enuma Elish and the Atrahasis, texts that describe a world where the Anunnaki, the princely offspring, were physical, active participants in the terrestrial realm. We saw the creation of humanity as a labor force, and the subsequent cataclysm of the Great Flood, which redefined the relationship between the creators and the created. However, as we move forward into the later 2nd millennium BCE, a subtle but profound shift occurs within the textual record. The gods, once described as walking among men and ruling directly from their temple estates, begin to recede. The vivid, direct dialogues between deity and human are replaced by ritual, omen, and administrative law. This episode examines this transition, the silent heavens. We will explore how the authority once attributed to the Anunnaki was transferred into the hands of human kings, priests, and institutions, and how the withdrawal of the divine shaped the birth of the modern state. In the earliest Sumerian literary layers, such as the tales of En-Merkar or the early cycles of Lugalbanda, the gods are immediate. They are characters who can be visited, petitioned in person, or encountered in the wilderness. But as the centuries progressed, the nature of the texts changed. Scholars note that in later Babylonian and Assyrian versions of these stories, the gods are increasingly depicted as residing in the high heavens. Their influence is felt not through physical presence, but through signs in the stars, the entrails of sacrificial animals, or the interpretation of dreams. This distancing is reflected in the architecture of the ziggurat. While originally conceived as a landing place or a home for the deity, it eventually became a restricted zone. The god was no longer a neighbor to the citizenry, but a remote sovereign accessible only to a specialized elite. The text suggests a world that was becoming increasingly disenchanted, a world where humans were left to manage the mechanics of civilization on their own. As the direct involvement of the Anunnaki diminished, a new justification for power was required. This transition is most clearly seen in the Sumerian king list. The document famously states that kingship descended from heaven. Initially, the kings were viewed as priest kings who acted as the literal stewards of a god's household. However, by the time of the Akkadian Empire under Sargon and his grandson Naram-Sin, the nature of kingship evolved. The king was no longer just a servant of the gods, he was their representative on earth. In some instances, such as with Naram-Sin, the king even began to deify himself, adopting the divine determinative before his name. Parallel to the rise of the monarch was the professionalization of the priesthood. In the absence of direct divine speech, the Baru, or diviners, became the essential intermediaries. They developed complex systems of logic and observation to interpret the will of the silent gods. This shift moved authority away from charismatic revelation and toward institutional knowledge. To know the will of the gods now required years of study, the mastery of Cuneiform, and the observation of celestial movements. The power to rule was now mediated through the intellect and the institution. Perhaps the most significant evidence of this transition is the emergence of written legal codes. In the earliest periods, order was maintained through divine decrees or blueprints of civilization held by the gods. By the time of the Code of Ur-Nammu, and later, the Code of Hammurabi, we see a shift toward codified, human-administered justice. While Hammurabi is depicted receiving the laws from the sun god Shamash, the laws themselves are remarkably pragmatic. They deal with property disputes, marriage contracts, and agricultural negligence. The gods are invoked as the ultimate witnesses and guarantors of justice, but the day-to-day enforcement is handled by human judges and governors. The divine rule of the early myths had been successfully translated into human governance. The Anunnaki had provided the framework, but the Babylonians and Akkadians were now the ones turning the gears of the machine. This marks the birth of the state as an independent entity, capable of functioning even when the gods seemed silent. Why did the gods withdraw? The ancient texts offer several perspectives, though they remain largely metaphorical. In the lamentation over the destruction of Ur, the goddess Ningal weeps because she is unable to change the decree of the higher gods to destroy her city. The text portrays the gods as being bound by a fate or destiny that even they cannot easily alter. In other traditions, the gods simply grew weary of the clamor of humanity, a theme we saw in the Atrahasis. By the late Babylonian period, there is a sense of nostalgia in the literature, a looking back to a golden age when the gods were closer. Historians and sociologists offer a different interpretation. They suggest that as Mesopotamian society became more complex, the old mythological explanations were no longer sufficient to manage a vast empire. The withdrawal of the gods may actually represent the psychological maturation of a civilization, moving from a state of total dependence on divine whim to a state of human responsibility and systemic law. The transition from divine rule to human authority left a permanent mark on history. It established the structures of priesthood, kingship, and law that would influence the Near East for millennia. But it also left behind a lingering question that appears in the later wisdom literature of Mesopotamia, such as the Ludlul Bel Nemeki, often called the Babylonian Job. If the gods are no longer walking among us, how can we truly know their intent? If the Anunnaki have retreated to the distant heavens, what is the ultimate purpose of the human institutions left in their wake? In our next episode, we will look closer at the specific technical and scientific legacies left by this transition, the mathematics, medicine, and astronomy that the ancients believed were gifts from the gods, but which they mastered with startling human precision. Join us for Episode 5, The Calculus of the Gods.